In the last section, we talked about semantic memory, and now I want to go on to discuss the brain mechanisms that support working memory, the ability to hold information in mind after the stimulus that generated the information is gone. And as we discussed earlier in the course, there are limits to this capability. We can't actively think about large numbers of objects at the same time. And I used the example of trying to imagine a pineapple, then holding the image of the pineapple in mind, think of a cat, and then keeping both visual images in mind, try to add the image of a clock and so forth. And the exercise becomes harder and harder. And once you get beyond 3 or 4 items, unless you can imagine them as a group, it becomes pretty much impossible to hold things together in your mind. A lot of brain regions tend to be active during a working memory task, including quite a few cortical areas, plus parts of the thalamus, striatum, and cerebellum, and so forth. In the cortex, for different types of working memory tasks, some of the active areas are different. In working memory for faces, for verbal memory, for spatial location, or for object features, some of the active areas are completely different, reflecting that the actual information being maintained is mostly located in different cortical areas. But there's a number of areas that tend to be active whatever the task type. But typically, these areas are a bit harder to identify because in any one task, they tend to be less active than the primary information containing areas. One way to identify those areas active during most working memory tasks is to compare the brain regions active when a task is completed successfully with the regions active when unsuccessful. And there's a task that's been used to do that. Subjects were briefly shown a visual image like this, then a blank screen, then after a few seconds time delay they were shown another image, and they were asked if the second image was the same as the first. In this case, one of the lines has changed orientation. When the subject was correct, there were a number of cortical areas that on average tended to be more active than when the subject didn't get it right, which suggests that these areas are performing some information processes that are needed for working memory in general. So the interesting question is, what are the information processes being performed by these areas? As we talked about earlier in the course, we measure working memory in the lab in a number of different ways. In list recall, subjects are shown sequences of objects and asked to immediately say what the objects were. Lists can be spoken names of objects or a sequence of pictures. Then in short-term forgetting, subjects are given a few objects to remember, then asked to recall what they were after carrying out some other distracting mental task for a few seconds. In visual memory span, subjects are briefly shown a large group of objects and then asked to say whatever they can remember out of the group. These 3 types of task involve verbal responses by subjects, but in visuospatial testing, the subjects are shown a visual pattern and afterwards asked to reconstruct it, and there's no verbal element in the task. Or a subject is shown someone else tapping a sequence of blocks, and afterwards they're asked to tap the blocks in the same sequence. Again, there's no spoken response required, but in this case there's a large element of somatosensory motor movement memory. And all of these tests look at the limits to the capacity of working memory. How many items we can remember, how long we can keep relatively meaningless information in our minds, how much relatively meaningless visual information we can recall, and so on. And of course, the reason we use relatively meaningless or unrelated information is to minimize the use of decorative memory in performing the tasks. So, I'm going to describe the information mechanisms that support working memory and see how they help us to understand the limits. This is the model for the organization of cortical areas that I'll be using for the working memory discussion. In this model, there's a number of areas that detect receptive fields at different complexity levels. There's 3 visual areas, and I've labelled them by the types of behavioral discriminations they're particularly effective at making. And, as I've emphasized repeatedly before, individual columns in the discriminates objects area, for example, don't correspond with object categories. They just provide the capability to discriminate between object categories. And also, although this one area may have receptive field complexities that are particularly effective for object discriminations, in practice, columns in other areas could have some object discrimination capability and will have recommendation strengths in favor of, say, naming different object categories. Then there's areas that detect receptive fields at different complexity levels within auditory inputs, and I've just illustrated one. But key to working memory is that there's all sorts of areas that detect receptive fields that are defined by different groups of columns in various other areas that are active at similar times. All these areas can differ in the areas from which they get their inputs, but also in the time frame over which their receptive fields are defined, as I'll get to in a moment. And I could perhaps comment that in reality the auditory and visual receptive fields are also defined by groups of columns in simpler areas that are active at similar times. It's just that in the auditory and visual areas, we can, to some degree, label perceptual meanings, even though they're partially ambiguous. In these other areas, the receptive field complexities are higher, and it's harder to put a cognitive label to the receptive fields. The area circled in green at the bottom left gets its inputs from the auditory discriminates words or numbers area. So its receptive fields are defined by groups of columns in that auditory area that are often active at the same time. And one column in this area targets columns in the discriminates visual objects area that tend to have been active when it was active. So this is the connectivity I talked about in the last section that's used to access semantic memories. Receptive fields in these areas are defined in the usual way by synapses onto pyramidal neuron dendrites. But in this case, neurons have lots of very weak synapses. These weak synapses show the phenomenon of augmentation. That's where, if the synapse receives a stream of action potentials, its weight increases significantly, but the increase only lasts for of the order of 10 seconds. So the receptive fields are very short term. Their definitions only last for a few seconds. So these receptive fields are defined by groups of columns in other areas that have recently been active at the same time. This area, for example, gets inputs from the discriminates visual objects area, and very short-term receptive fields are defined that are groups of discriminates visual objects receptive fields that have recently been active at the same time. A column in this area targets back to the discriminates visual objects columns that define its receptive field. So this area can prolong the activity of columns in the discriminates visual objects area, subject to release of its outputs by the basal ganglia and thalamus and selection of the prolonged behavior by those subcortical structures. A column in this area defines a receptive field made up of a group of columns in the discriminates groups of objects area that were recently active at the same time, and targets the columns in the same group that define its receptive field. So again, it would tend to prolong current activity in the discriminates groups of objects area. The receptive fields in this area are defined by groups of columns in the lower area that have recently been active at the same time, and those columns target columns in the top area that have recently been active at the same time, but again using weak synapses that can be augmented for of the order of 10 seconds by incoming action potentials. So again, they target columns in the top area that have recently been active at the same time as they have. So this is the architecture that we'll use to understand the information processes supporting different types of list recall. But it's important to bear in mind that there could be different combinations of possible information processes that could implement a behavior. I'm describing one approach that uses a sequence of available information processes, and other sequences could possibly perform the same cognitive function. But the key point is that the brain has to carry out cognitive processes with columns and neurons that don't know anything about objects, categories, and so on. The only things columns and neurons can know is that other groups of columns or neurons were active in the past at the same time as they were, either recently, many occasions in the past, and so on. And the brain has to use just this temporal correlation type information in various ways to carry out cognitive processes. For recall of lists of random words, we only need this smaller set of areas. And we'll use the convention once again that colouring columns in different shades of red to indicate detection of receptive fields at different phases of frequency modulation. So when the first word is heard, receptive fields are directly detected in the auditory area. These detections drive activations of columns in the second area, with receptive fields defined by combinations of auditory fields that have often been active at the same time in the past. Those columns drive indirect activation of columns in the discriminate visual objects area that have often been active in the past at the same time. In other words, this is the semantic memory mechanism described earlier. The top area on the left has receptive fields that are groups of columns in the visual area that have recently been active at the same time. So some of these columns are activated. Each of these activated columns targets back to the columns in the visual area that make up its just defined receptive field. So a cycle is set up in which each area preserves the pattern of activity in the other area. This activity will be at a specific phase of frequency modulation, and I'll indicate that by pink. The next word is heard and drives direct detection of receptive fields in the auditory area. But the existing looped activity in the other two areas is still maintained. The semantic memory mechanism repeats, leading to a second activation in the visual area at a different phase of modulation from the already existing activation. And the activity of this second column population in the visual area can again be prolonged by a loop with the top left area at a different modulation phase indicated by pale pink. So there are now two active populations being maintained. When the third word is heard, the process repeats, generating a third active column population in the visual objects area, which can again be prolonged at a third modulation phase. Now, a fourth word is heard, but when the population reaches the visual information area, there are already three active populations at three different phases of modulation. So there's no room for the new word unless the population corresponding with one of the earlier words is extinguished. So a working memory limit is imposed by the number of different phases of modulation that can be simultaneously supported in the same area. But this limit can be exceeded if the words aren't completely random. If some words can be linked into meaningful groups or chunks, much longer lists can be recalled. So we'll use the same architecture as before and think about processing a list of 6 words, but they're linked semantically into 2 chunks: nurse, doctor, hospital. So you might imagine a nurse helping a doctor at a hospital, and farmer, cow, barn, maybe a farmer looking after a cow in a barn. We need more of the architecture than we used for the verbal list recall of completely random words, but initially we can still leave out the discriminates groups of groups area. So as in the case of the earlier list, when the first 3 words on the list have been processed, there are 3 independent populations of active columns in the visual objects area, maintained active by looping with that other area at the top left, which has the short-term receptive fields. But if the outputs from the three populations in the discriminates objects area are brought into the same modulation phase at the input level to the discriminates groups of objects area, then, because there's a semantic link between the words, there's enough past experience in which the three occurred together to result in a population of receptive field detections in the discriminates groups of objects area, approximating to looking at a scene in which a nurse and doctor are together in a hospital. That discriminates groups population in turn will drive an activation in this area circled in green, creating short-term receptive fields corresponding with groups of columns in the discriminates groups area that are active at the same time. And once again, a column in this area has reciprocal connectivity back to the discriminates groups columns that define its receptive field, so again there's a loop set up that can prolong activity of the column populations. Now let's think about the contribution of this area. Remember, it has receptive fields that are combinations of columns in this lower area that have recently been active at the same time, where recently means less than 10 seconds. So if a set of columns are active in the lower area, receptive fields will be created in the upper area that are defined by different subsets of those active columns. And those newly created receptive fields will of course be detected. And the outputs indicating detections by the newly created receptive fields target the area that's maintaining the active loop with columns in the visual discriminates between objects area. The synapses onto neurons in these prolonging activity columns are again weak, and again strongly augmented if the target neuron is firing, and again the synaptic weights decay over a period of the order of 10 seconds. The thalamus implements the selective behavior of allowing these detections to flow for long enough to establish the receptive field connectivity, and then no longer supports the flow. After which, the activity corresponding with the three words in the discriminates visual objects area and the area supporting activity prolongation is extinguished. But the activity in the discriminates groups of objects area and in the area that supports prolongation of the activity continues. This activity is comparable with what will be present if the brain was actually looking at a nurse with a doctor in a hospital, but without the sensory input or any receptive field detections even at the object level. Now, the next three words are heard. Once again, a pattern of column activation is created in the discriminates objects and associated activity prolongation areas, corresponding with the three words in the second phrase, and maintained at different phases of frequency modulation. But at the same time, activity is still being prolonged in the discriminates groups of objects area, corresponding with nurse and doctor at hospital. If the outputs of the three populations in the discriminates objects area are released to the discriminates groups area, they'll drive a second population of column activations in that area, corresponding perhaps with a farmer and a cow in a barn, at a different modulation phase from the still existing doctor-nurse hospital population. This new population drives receptive field detections in the activity prolongation area, and looping activity is set up at the different modulation phase. So now there's two independent populations of columns being maintained active in the discriminates groups of objects area, corresponding with the two groups of three words. Then all the activity in the discriminates objects areas is extinguished, but activity of the two populations in the discriminates groups area continues. So at this point, information derived from the 6 words is still present to a degree. The question being, how can the behaviors of speaking those words be achieved? Suppose that the activity at one phase of modulation in the area supporting activity prolongation is released to the short-term receptive fields in this area. This is not really a synchronization because synchronization is already being maintained. Rather, it means that the thalamus must apply extra stimulation to the input layer of this target area, and the stimulation must be in phase with one of the column populations already active in the activity prolongation area. The effect is to select one of these populations and drive receptive field detections in that target area. But remember that these receptive fields are short-term, so they'll only be detected if the activity that defined them occurred within the last few seconds. But if they are detected, they'll drive activity of column populations in the area that prolongs activity in the discriminates visual objects area, which in turn can drive activity in that discriminates object area. These columns will have recommendation strengths, for example, in favor of speaking the words in the phrase. So this mechanism supports extending the capacity of working memory by chunking. Chunking could be extended further by using an analogous mechanism at the discriminates groups of groups level, combining populations at the groups level and later reconstructing them, then reconstructing the word populations that have the appropriate speech recommendation strengths. So let me emphasize again that to support cognitive processes like working memory, the brain has to find a sequence of activations, each step in the sequence using only information that can be derived from past temporal correlations in activity. And those activations are at root the activations of neurons. So in the next section, we'll have a look at these neuron level mechanisms and see how they result in the various limits of working memory capacity that we've been discussing.